Awesome. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Good? Yay. Good, good. Everybody have a decent weekend? Ish? Yeah. No, me too. That's what happens when you work on Saturday and then again on Tuesday. There's not really a weekend. It's an evil thing. So hopefully you guys got a lot of work done over the weekend, though, with what weekend we had. As you know, your weekly turn-in is just about due. Who can tell me what's due at your weekly turn-in? What do you have to make? Anything in particular? 3 level 1 assets. So make sure you're modeling 3 level 1 assets. And in terms of the modeling, what is critically important is that you are actually modeling these things. They're not blockouts. We're not taking shapes and shoving them together. We're using the multi-cut tool, we are using the insert edge loop tool, and we are using the extrude tool. If you are not using these tools, you are not modeling, and you will be very surprised at the grade you receive. So make sure you are modeling these assets, very much like you did with your lecture 3 skill check. That jar, that was modeling. The jar is ceramic. It is made of one piece of material, that clay that they fired in that particular shape. And as a result, when you model it, it's going to be made out of one piece of geometry. So make sure that, again, when you are modeling, you are using the modeling tools. That is your best indication that you're doing things the right way. And as always, check the modeling guideline sheet, which is, of course, on FSO, which tells you how many pieces each object should be made of. So that's going to help you in the event that you're having a little bit of trouble. That's a ballpark number to give you an idea. Hey, you know, it says this object should be made of 3 pieces. Mine's made of 4, or mine's made of 2. I'm probably pretty close. I'm going to be okay. But if you're modeling something and it says it should only be made of about 3 pieces and you've got 75, that's a warning flag. Does that make sense? That parts guide is there to help you make sure you're in the right area in terms of how many pieces things should be made of. As with all of your turn-ins, I do have a nice video that I made for you guys called the video weekly turn-in procedure, I think is the name of the video. If you go to the weekly turn-in, it's right up at the top. Watch the video, watch the video, watch the video. The turn-in process is somewhat complicated. Okay, there's a number of steps, so you've got to follow all of them, obviously. And the very first weekly turn-in video is a little long. I apologize for that. It's about 20 minutes in length, but it is exhaustive in terms of the material. I cover absolutely to the letter everything you need to do. You watch that video and do everything you see in the video, you're going to do terrific on your week 1 turn-in. If you don't watch that video, you're going to miss something, most likely. So make sure you're watching the video to learn and follow the procedure, because I don't go over that in class. That's just on that video. So you do have to watch that. Does that make sense? Get a hell yeah there? Hell yeah. Okay, good. So make sure.
Turn-in video has blockouts on it, so make sure you refer to the FSO.
Oh, no, there's a new week 1 turn-in video. It does not talk about blockout. It is straight up modeling. So they're good. In terms of the stuff we're looking for, again, everything is going to be due at midnight, so make sure you get it in well before that. I recommend very highly at 11 p.m. Stop working. I don't care where you are. Start saving up. Start naming things. Use your self-grade document. Go through all the stuff you have to do. Double check your work, because remember, the stuff on the self-grade document accounts for about 67, 68% of your grade, so make sure you're looking at that. And then have something you can turn in. If you need to, you can go back and mess with stuff a little bit more if you have a little bit of time. But it's better to have something you can turn in. Does that make sense? And I got to be honest with you. I've been teaching this class for 10, 11 years at this point. Work that is submitted at 11:59 is usually not very good anyway. Does that make sense? If you're working right up to 11:59, it's probably not going to be your best effort. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, so again, 11 o'clock, start looking over the self-grade, start making sure you're doing the things you need to do. They're yes-no things, they're very quick and very easy, and that's where the bulk of the points are. Don't be foolish and ignore that, because that's what's going to hurt you grade-wise. Does that make sense? Get the easy ones, get the easy points, because they're there. You just have to look at that document and you got it. And the only thing that would stop that document from helping you is if you didn't understand what those things were on the self-grade document. And of course, what's on that self-grade document is the material we cover in class. So obviously something got missed. So you can review any lectures you need to, go to the Google Hangout and get some help if you need to. Make sure you know what those terms are, what we're asking for, so that you can do well. And the reason I encourage you very strongly to do well on this first turn-in, because this is the easiest one. It's the first turn-in. This one's a cakewalk. You should be able to get through this one pretty easily. The submissions get much harder as we go. And I mean harder as in more details, more demanding in terms of what we're looking for, and more models in general. So each of these turn-ins is going to take successively more time. Does that make sense? So hit this one out of the park, give yourself a nice solid base to work from, and start moving into these other ones because they're going to be harder. And I don't mean harder as in difficult for you to understand. It's all modeling. You could do all of them from here on out. I'm just going to show you some new tricks and techniques on how to do it better or faster. It's just modeling though. But it's going to take more time because they're more complicated. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, good. And again, I just try to warn you up front. I'm a red pill guy. I'm going to tell you what I see, what I think, and what I know to help you be more successful. Yes? Yes. You can absolutely resubmit. And honestly, what I recommend is work ahead. Always work ahead if you can, but don't submit until you're getting closer to the deadline. Because often you find out something like, shoot, I didn't know that or I didn't realize that. But I don't mind more than one submission. It's not a big deal. But do us both a favor, and you don't want to have like 47 submissions because that gets difficult for me to keep track of which one is the one you really want me to grade. And you don't want me guessing which one you want me to grade. I should know. Does that make sense? So do us both a favor and try to keep the submissions to a minimum. But if you realize you need to submit again, that's totally fine. That's totally fine. No worries there. Does that make sense on the work a little bit ahead, but just don't turn it in yet? And always a great idea. Talk to us in the lab. Come to us in the Google Hangout and say, hey, I'm thinking of turning this in. Am I missing anything? I mean, honestly, I've not heard of a class where you could do that. You know, here's my work. I'm about to turn it in, you know, tonight or whatever. What am I missing? And we will look at it, no charge, and tell you exactly what to do to get a better grade. That's awesome. And all that requires on your part is to work just a tiny bit ahead so that you have something to show us so we can give you some feedback before you turn it in. You work to the last minute, there's a lot of like fingers crossed kind of stuff going on. And you don't want that to be the case. You want to be pretty solid with what you've turned in. Does that make sense? Okay, good. Because it's all about communication. You know, you got to think of Brian and I and Marcus and Sarah as like your supervisors. You know, this is your job, right? You want to make sure you're doing a good job. So you get feedback as you go. Hey, how's this going? Is this what you need? Is this what you want? Yeah. Great. Okay. So when it gets to that deadline, you can sleep that night because you know you've turned in. Excuse me, I'm sorry. You know you've turned in what your supervisor wants. Does that make sense? If you wait to the last minute and try to slip it under the door, yeah, I hope I did what they wanted. You know, that's not good. That's not ideal. So good work habits is part of what we're trying to teach you in here. And when we say 3D foundations, there's a lot of different levels of foundations we're trying to teach you. And some of the big ones are time management, and again, communication, feedback, and adjustment. What's asked for being done. Those are keys to keeping your job. Hell yeah? Good, because that's my job. I really, more than anything, I want to put you guys in those chairs that you want to be in, working on those games you want to work on and working on the movies. Nothing makes me feel better than to see you guys be successful. That makes my day. So I take it seriously. Thank you, Brian. I take it very seriously.
Yeah, we do.
All right, so let's get into today's material. We're going to be talking about edge quality today, which is a critical aspect of making the objects look a little bit more realistic, like the objects in our real world. We are going to be delving into, the cleanup tool. Remember I promised you last class we were going to talk about how do we find naughty faces on a polygon object. Incidentally, a polygon face with 3 sides is called a what? Trie. 4 sides? 5 or more? N-gon, and those are naughty, so we don't ever want those. So we're going to talk about how do we find those things and how do we fix those things. And one of the things we're going to do is an exercise. I'd like you guys to think of yourselves as like polygon doctors. And what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a list of ailments, you know, runny nose, fever, you know, I'm going to give you these different various ailments and then tell you what you have to do to treat those various ailments. So when you get to your polygons and they're sick, because sometimes they have problems, you know how to look for the problem and how to fix the problem, because that's the important part. Fixing your geometry so that it is mathematically sound and it is good, clean, efficient, hard-working geometry that will help everybody in the pipeline from you on down to through the rendering. Because that's your big fear is, I hope what I made is good and it's making everyone else's job easy, not hard. Because you don't want to be the one that's making everybody else work harder. Does that make sense? Okay, that leads to some animosity. That's not good. Boo-how. All right. But before that, we're going to start talking about modeling in a series of passes in what we call levels of detail. And when you're modeling, and I've said this about a zillion times, when you're modeling, it's a lot like drawing or illustration. The idea that you start with something simple and then you revisit your illustration in a series of passes, adding detail with each pass. And that way you ensure light, efficient geometry that does everything you need it to do with the least amount of work to achieve shape change. So our first pass, much like our first bit of drawing where we do lines of action and we start filling in the basic volumes of an object, is where we're talking about our primary forms. So primary forms are the major shapes in whatever object we're creating, spheres, cubes, cones, and so forth. This is very much like a blockout. We are occupying volume. Where is this thing? How much space does it take up? And often in a blockout, what we're doing is we're trying to create an idea of where everything is going to be. Because again, it's easier to draw from the outside inward with regard to detail than to start with intense detail and work your way outward. So the blockout is extremely helpful with that. And to be perfectly honest with you, in a lot of instances, we will utilize blockouts to help us envision how the scene is going to come together. We'll have a very simple and crude example of what it's going to look like, and then we hone all of those materials to make finer detail. Much like sometimes when you're doing a drawing, you do a very light sketch to give yourself an idea of how everything's going to fit. How many of you guys have ever done a drawing where all of a sudden you realize something you wanted to draw is off the paper? Right? Isn't that obnoxious? You hate that. And the problem, Gesundheit, the problem there is you didn't work out your blocking before you started drawing. And that's why it ended up off the page. So if you draw sort of a light outline, some sketchy lines to sort of frame where everything is going to go in advance, you will never draw off the page because you know where everything's going to go. So this is something you learn to do. Point being, with modeling, same thing holds true. We block things out so we can get some crude shape and form information in there to help us see how it's all going to fit together in the bigger picture. Make sense? Hell yeah. Oh, that was very somber. Hell yeah. Did something terrible happen over the weekend I didn't know about? You went to school. School's not terrible. This is fun. Honestly, this should be fun because what you're doing is learning the tips, the tricks, the skills, the tools that you need to get to the job you want to do. You know what I mean? And this should be fun. It really should. I mean, even if maybe modeling's not your thing, this is the path to what it is you want to do. So I hope it's fun because this is what you'd be getting paid for. If you hate this, work will be much harder. Does that make sense? Because you're not going to be modeling fun stuff at work. You're going to be making trees. I told you about my friend who worked at EA and made trees, right? I told you about that? Yeah, I have a friend who worked at EA and he built trees every day, all the time. It's not very exciting. And what makes matters worse is he made trees for a car racing game. So everything is going, you don't even see it unless you crash. You're like, hey, nice tree. But point being, when you are working for hire, you're not building what you want to build. You're building what they want you to build. Does that make sense? Not as much fun. So enjoy this, because this is actually a pretty good time. All right, so again, when it comes to modeling, just like illustration, we're talking about our primary forms, the major volumes and shapes that we see when we're drawing the object. Now, once all the primary forms and shapes are in place, then we move into our secondary forms. We start connecting these pieces to each other. How do these things actually come together? How do these connections and these changes in shapes occur? These are our secondary forms. So again, we're just starting to connect some primary elements to each other and quote unquote flesh it out to make it look like a more solid object. Does that make sense? Secondary form. And in this way, since we've already worked out our primary forms, nothing's going to go off the paper. So here we are working in our secondary forms, again, connecting our primary forms to each other. Then we move into what we call the tertiary forms. And the tertiary forms are the details that really sell these objects as realistic. Little tiny details, venting, screws, bolts, nuts, seams between pieces of metal. You know, these little tiny detail, in this instance, the wrinkles on the shirt and the shorts. This is what sells it as real in terms of its appearance. Without these details, things tend to look fake and toy-like. So we try to avoid that. Again, what makes a model great is the details. So in terms of the illustration, this can be encompassed in our tertiary forms. Does that make sense? Any questions on primary, secondary, and tertiary forms? Okay, good. It is fairly straightforward, but I want to make sure you have an opportunity to ask about it. So again, illustration and modeling, very similar in their ideology in that we start simple, broad stroke, and then we go into refinement. With each pass, we revisit what we're creating, and that leads to efficiency. Okay. We've got a periwinkle colored vocabulary component, which means that we are talking about something that is on the self-grade document. Now, it's true this is not something you'll be graded on your week 1 turn-in, but you bet your bottom dollar it'll be on week 2. So this is definitely something that you need to know and understand. And what we're talking about is edge quality. And edge quality is the idea that the personality, the character of objects is contained within edge quality. And the idea is when surfaces come together, they don't truly come together at 90-degree angles. That just doesn't happen. There's always a little bit of rounding going on when you're looking at how those things come together. So for example, if you take a look at the desk you're sitting at right now, if you look at where the top of the desk meets the side of the desk, that's not a sharp 90-degree angle that you would cut your finger on if you touched it. If you rub your thumb over that transition from the top of the desk to the side, there's even the slightest little bit of rounding there, a little bit of curvature. And the reality of our universe, Gesundheit, is that there is no such thing as edges coming together at exactly 90 degrees. There's always that little bit of rounding going on there. So what we want to do is incorporate that rounding into the objects we build. And then that is referred to as edge quality, because we're talking about how the highlights and the shadows meet, where those surfaces change shape. And then therefore we get the edge quality, or the quality of edge, in the geometry. Now, to better help you understand that, we're going to talk about cars. Yay, cars are cool. Now, this is a Cadillac. It was made in the 50s. If you look at the car and you look at the transitions that take place as we go from surface to surface, there's definitely a look, a feel, a personality, or a character to this car. And it doesn't matter where you look on it, you see a lot of the same kinds of things going on. Everything's got these nice, soft, rounded transitions from place to place. This looks like a fun car, right? And honestly, it was built in an era in U.S. history where we were kind of having a lot of fun. You know, World War II is over. We've got economic prosperity. Things are looking good. You know, happy days. Da, da, da. Anyway, point being, things are good. People are happy. The look, the design, and the feel of character of vehicles at that time seemed to kind of reflect that to a certain degree. And what's interesting is if you look at other cars that were made in the 50s, a lot of them have the same look to them. You could spot a car and go, that one was made in the 50s, I'll bet. And you're probably pretty close. So point being, there's definitely something about that vehicle, and you look at the transitions from the sides to the tops of the surfaces and how the highlights and the shadows play off of each other, you can see the quality of the edge or the transition between those surfaces. And again, it's throughout the vehicle. Now, in contrast, let's take a look at another Cadillac. This one was built in the 70s, okay? Different era, different look and different feel. Look at how hard these edges are. Look at how crisp and how firm those transitions are. Totally different in terms of the transition from one surface to another. Still rounded, but a lot less. Harder, edgier, okay? Also, again, reflective of the era. 70s were a tough time. A lot of unrest going on. And in terms of the vehicle, you can see it, it's evident. And again, much like the 50s Cadillac, a lot of vehicles that were made in the 70s kind of had that look and feel to them, the harder, edgier appearance. And not at all wind resistant. But point being, there's a look to the edge quality on those surfaces and how they come together. Does that make sense now, what we're talking about, edge quality, the character of an object? Now, the good news is edge quality is a pretty easy thing for us to incorporate into our models. While it's true, we could use the insert edge loop tool to accomplish this. We could use the multi-cut tool to accomplish this. We could use the extrude tool to accomplish this. But what's super nice is there's a tool built into Maya that is very, very easy to use and actually a little bit fun called the bevel tool. And the bevel tool will actually accomplish that little bit of rounding that we're looking for very easily. And it's a nice little thing that we can do when we're modeling to kind of put that final pièce de résistance on our geometry and make it look beautiful. That little bit of rounding that makes it look less like a video game asset, because everything in a video game, low poly, comes together with a really hard edge and everything looks very sort of jaggy. We make things smooth because we're trying to go for realism. Does that make sense? So we're going to try to get that rounding in there because that is reflective of the world as we understand it and how it works. So we're going to use that bevel tool to accomplish what we need it to do. So as with most of the stuff I show you guys how to do, we have a fun little activity that we're going to do using the bevel tool. So make sure, because we're about to do an activity, we do what? Set the project to the activity file folder. So we get Maya up and running. Hi, Maya. Long time no see. File open. I was up late last night grading, so Maya and I were hanging out. All right, so I'm going to set my project file. Set project to my activity file folder, and then open my scene, and I want my bevel tool activity. All right, in the bevel tool activity, you'll notice I got a couple of pieces of geometry in here for you guys to play with. And you can see I've got 90-degree angles in here. Everything looks really hard, right? Like a low poly video game, very hard edged, the way these transitions take place. And it's very visible when you see the highlight and shadow information. So what we're going to do is try to utilize the bevel tool to kind of take that edge off a little bit. What I'd like you to do is imagine the bevel tool is kind of like sandpaper. And what we're going to do is literally just kind of sand the corners of stuff a little bit to make it softer. All right, the bevel tool works on edges by design. So you go to edge mode and you select your edges. And you'll notice that I grabbed all of the edges on the top of this object, not just some of them. And you'll see when we use that tool why we grab them all. But we grab all the edges across the top, and then we go to Edit Mesh, and you will see Bevel. And what's really cool about the Bevel tool is it has this sort of interactive dialog box here, which allows us to make adjustments while we're using the tool, which is, I think, very cool. This first component here, fraction, is talking about how much of the corner are we sanding. So what I can do is I can actually hover my cursor over the word fraction, and using my left mouse button held down, if I move my mouse left and right, I can actually change how much is being sanded off in terms of the corners. So I can kind of adjust that thickness interactively and see how that's going to make the change to the geometry. Edit Mesh Bevel. Yep, it's like the third tool down. Second. All right. Now, the next thing I'm going to touch on, segments. Now, segments is talking about how many edges are between these two new edges that I've created. And again, if you hover your cursor over the word and use your left mouse button, just hold it down and drag left and right, and you can add segments or take segments away. And what you'll notice about the number of segments you have is if you have fewer segments, it looks more angular, again like the 70s car. But the more segments you have, the more rounded and smooth it appears, like the 50s car. So it really has to do with how many segments you've got in there. All right. Now, another fun little thing that we can work with is depth. And what depth is talking about is when we sand off those corners, what's the degree of sort of bubbling that we're getting. So again, hover your cursor over the word depth, hold down the left mouse button, and one gives you the sort of more rounded outward sort of style. But as you go into smaller values, it kind of straightens it out a little bit. And if you go into the negative field, it actually reverses it and it goes inward. So it's kind of cool. It breathes better than I do. All right. So you can make adjustments to the depth there. And again, what's nice is look at how the quality of edge is different now. Look at how the geometry, how the light plays on that surface and the shadow, and how much nicer that looks, how much more realistic that looks. Does that make sense? Really easy, and it's a dramatic improvement. So let's take a look at this cylinder here. We're going to take the tool to this one as well. Let's say this is, I don't know, the top of a bottle you built. Or maybe a jar, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. You see this nice smooth transition on the side. You see this? I got some shading on the outsides, and it's nice and smooth in here. I can't round that anymore. Does that make sense? It's already round. It's already curved. Therefore, I'm not going to try to use the bevel tool on curved surfaces. Does that make sense? I want to use this tool where I have a transition from the top to the side, where I've got that 90-degree angle. So I click one edge, and I could hold shift and click each subsequent edge, but a handy way to select a whole bunch of edges at once is double click on a single edge, and it will select everything all the way around like lightning on that edge loop. All right. Now I'm going to run my bevel, and again I'm going to play with the fraction. I'm going to adjust my segments. Right. Now look at that nice smooth, much more glass bottle-like appearance to that edge I've got. Nice smooth transition here as opposed to the interior here, which is a very hard edge. This would hurt your lip if you drank out of this, right? This out here, not so much. So let's fix this one too. Again, double click on an edge and it grabs the entire edge loop. Edit Mesh Bevel. Bring that fraction in a little bit, put a couple segments on it. And now that looks so much more like the opening to a bottle or a jug or a jar, right? So this is a very easy tool to work. So what we're going to do is I left you this last piece of crazy geometry for you to play with. And what I want you to do is use your bevel tool. And again, it works on edges. So select the edges in question that you want to play with. And Edit Mesh Bevel, and Brian and I are going to walk around and watch and see what you guys do. And I'm hoping you will see that if you select like a single edge and do a bevel, you'll notice you start getting some crazy looking geometry. Some weird stuff starts happening. So you do have to be very careful when you're using this tool because it will create bad geometry if you let it. So just be very cognizant of that when you're playing with it. But do see what you can do about the edge quality on this piece of geometry. And as I said, Brian and I are going to walk around and see how you guys are doing with it. Okay? So let's play for a little bit. Always a good idea to play when you can. No laptop today? Oh, yeah, you're gonna need that. Good, good. Nice, good.
Going beyond the parameters they give you is kind of fun too.
What's that?
Typing the numbers appears.
Oh yeah, you can plug in values. Yeah, that's what's nice about being able to enter something into a field rather than yes, no. You know, there's a lot more variables. And I encourage you guys to play whenever you can. You will learn more by playing than you will ever learn in a classroom.
You're not following along.
All right, now remember, you don't want to bevel these edges because it's already smooth there. You want to work these guys up there. Because all that's going to do is increase your geometry. It's not really going to smooth it any. How are we doing? Good? Good. All right, how are you doing? Well, grab some edges. Okay, hold shift and grab a couple of them. Just remember, Maya is a two-handed application, so you always want to have two hands working. So hold shift. Anytime you're using one, you know you're handicapping yourself. There you go. All right, now tumble it a little bit and grab one edge on the other side. Can you tumble your view? Okay.
Not really.
Okay, well, you should definitely be able to do that because otherwise you can't get around your object. For now, just grab those four on the top.
It's a nice little tool, isn't it?
Oh, hold on. You just want to grab those four edges on the top. Just click off into space.
These ones.
Yeah, just click off here so nothing is selected. All right, now select those four on the top. That one, that one, that one, that one. Okay, now go to Edit Mesh Bevel. All right, so you can see it kind of rounded it a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, now if you increase the number of segments, which is in here, you see it's set for 1.
Right.
Put in like 6. Just click in a value. And then hit enter. See how that puts more of them in there? All right, now if you look at depth, it's at 1, right? Put in 0.5. And you can enter it there or there, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Sometimes you're getting too many corners.
0.5, and then hit enter. And see, now it's a little bit less angled. Now put in negative 0.5. Negative, and then 0.5. And then enter. Now it's going in a little bit. Does that make sense? So there's all kinds of stuff you can play with. And if you're having a hard time with the tablet, you may want to look into getting a mouse.
Yeah, I am actually gonna go buy one.
Okay, yes, please do. It's going to make a difference in your world. So do yourself a huge favor and give yourself the tools you need to be successful, because that's important. Yes. Listen, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that right now. We're doing activities, but I can help you with that in the lab for sure. All right, so what do you guys think? This is a pretty easy tool to work with, right? It does a lot of stuff. You don't have to work too hard with it, so it's pretty fun. How'd you guys do? Did Brian have a chance to take a look?
Yeah, we're good.
Good. Awesome, awesome. All right. Now, something I want to talk about really quickly with you guys before we get on to the next thing. I know some of you are trying to work on your assignments while you're in class. Honestly, that is ill-advised at best. The reason being, I know you're thinking, oh, this is 2 more hours that I can work on my stuff that's due tonight, and I haven't given it enough attention. But the problem you run into is the material I teach you is cumulative, and the 2 hours you spend working on your assignments in class and kind of half listening to me, you're going to miss something that's going to hurt you grade-wise later on. So you might net a little bit in this little tiny, 2 hours in terms of your progress on the stuff that's due tonight, but the time spent not listening to the stuff I'm talking about is definitely going to hurt you later. Does that make sense? It's a very short-term gain, very short-term. So if you want to work on your assignments, I'm not going to stop you. That's your call. But here's the thing. I know who's working on their assignments in class and who's listening and doing the activities. So if you come up to me later and say, hey, look, I have no idea how to use the Bevel tool. Can you teach me again? And I'll say, well, you were working on your assignments in class. That's why you don't know how to do it. Does that make sense? It's not education when it's convenient for you. I am lecturing now. This is your chance to learn and grow and ask me questions and do these assignments. Does that make sense? Again, thank you. It's your call. You do what you want with your time. You are big enough boys and girls at this stage that I don't have to tell you. But realize that there's going to be a cost for that. And just, you got to be willing to live with that. And that's part of being responsible, I'm going to do what I want to do. There may be a price for that. And I'm willing to pay it, and I understand it. It's on me. And that's the important part. Does that make sense? Okay. Because I am absolutely 100% here for you guys. But if you're not really trying, that it makes it a lot harder on you. And then it's equally frustrating for me because I want you to be successful. I want you guys to do great. But if you're not engaged with class material, it makes it way harder for both of us. So again, I just want to put that out there. You are big enough boys and girls. You can do what you want with your time, but be aware there will be a cost. I can almost guarantee it. So make sure you're making a good decision when you decide what it is you want to do. All right, good. Again, I just wanted to say that. So I hope what you guys came to realize in using these tools is that there's a lot of really fun stuff that you can do to make your models look better in terms of this tool that is super easy to use. And again, very quickly changes the edge quality of your geometry. So when you're looking at your week 2 turn-in, which is going to be, I believe it's 3 level 1 assets and 2 level 2 assets or some such combination like that. One of the things you will notice that I'm looking for in the self-grade document, you're going to see something called edge quality. So when you see edge quality, you should be thinking bevel tool. Make that connection. And then in terms of the use of the tool, you want to use that when you're towards the end of your modeling process. I want to start sort of rounding things a little bit to make them look smoother and more realistic. Because that's what we're doing in this class. We're going for realism, or as close to real as we can get with the tools and knowledge we have at this stage in our modeling careers. So again, we want to get that little bit of rounding on the edges of things so that they just look a little bit more realistic. So you want to do that not at the beginning of your modeling process, but towards the end, sort of a little ending bit. Yes?
I ran into this issue, I don't know if you can answer it now, but when using the bevel tool, there's certain edges that have no effect.
It has everything to do with the amount of curvature that's already in place. Because what you really want to use the bevel tool on is where you're getting surfaces that come together at like 90 degrees or in that range. If you've got something that's already got a decent on it, it's not going to do anything because it's already curved. Does that make sense? So like, for example, if you grab the edges around the side of the cylinder, that's already curved. So all that's going to do is add more edges, but not really enhance the amount of curvature there. Now, if you had a cylinder that you wanted to be more smooth and more curved, you would have to increase the number of components on that thing. Because if you've got, on any polygon object, everything is made of vertices. And between 2 points, you have to have a straight line. So if what you're looking at is too jagged, what you need is more points, more of these little straight lines. And if you look at the most smooth, natural, curved piece of geometry you've ever seen in your life, if it's a polygon object, if you get close enough, you're going to see there's still 2 points with a straight line between it. There's just so many of them that now it looks smooth and curved. Does that make sense? So more components is typically the answer in those instances. When you're doing all the curvature with geometry. There are also tricks that we use, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. I don't know today, but within a day or two, where we can actually soften the normals in the way Maya lights the geometry to make it appear as if it's smoother than it really is by changing the angle of the light on the surface. But we'll get into that later. But for now, bevel tool, great for putting rounding on things. And again, when you see edge quality on your self-grade document, we're talking bevel tool. So make sure you're using that towards the end of your modeling process. If you want to, you can incorporate it with your week 1 turn-in. It's not something you will gain or lose any points for, but it's good practice to try to use this stuff. So if you get a chance and you have the time, why not give it a shot? All right, let's get into some more stuff here. All right, here we go. That clean geometry. We've got another periwinkle vocabulary component, which means this is something that's going to be on our self-grade documents. We got to make sure that we have a good understanding of this. Clean geometry is the idea that when you model whatever it is you're modeling, you want to make sure that it's predominantly 4-sided faces that all come together to build this thing, and it doesn't have other major geometry elements. Now, we've talked about 3-sided faces being tris, 4-sided faces being quads, and anything with 5 or more being an n-gon. Those are pretty straightforward in terms of the problem, and we're going to talk about how to fix that. But there are some other issues that crop up with geometry that leads to files crashing, that leads to tools not functioning properly, and of course, all kinds of issues throughout the production pipeline in terms of UV mapping, lighting and rendering. So there's a lot of issues that can crop up as a result of what we call sick or poor quality geometry, not mathematically sound. So we're going to talk about the different elements and then what you do to fix them. So first we're going to talk about what's wrong with the geometry so you can recognize it. And then we're going to get into, okay, so how do I fix these things? So first we have to talk about what's wrong with the geometry and what it looks like. So again, in terms of the things that can happen and the problems that can occur, you know, tools not working, files crashing, renders crashing. So we try to avoid this kind of thing. So let's get into a couple of the issues. And again, after we go through them, then we're going to talk about how to fix them. All right. Here's an issue that comes up for first-time modelers, and that is the concept of, or the issue of, unsupported vertices. And the problem we're having here is these vertices here are unsupported in that they are not properly attached to the other vertices on the geometry. Now, in some instances, you do need to have an opening in your geometry, but there's a way to make that mathematically sound as well. I mean, not only is this these vertices not attached properly and unsupported, but if you look at this face here, this is a huge 8-sided polygon, which again makes that an n-gon. But if you take a look, this piece of geometry here is the same thing, but this is mathematically sound. There's no issues here. This is not going to cause problems. So you can get the shapes you want, you just have to do it properly. So we got to make sure that these vertices are properly connected to each other to ensure that it works well. Non-planar faces. Non-planar faces is the idea that you want to keep all of your vertices nice and flat, nice and happy in the same plane. I'd like you to think of each face on the objects you're building like a piece of paper, right? Nice and flat. All 4 vertices more or less in the same plane. Where you start getting into trouble is where one of the vertices is significantly out of alignment with the others. And what it causes some distortion or torsion on the face of the polygon geometry. So what you don't want is you don't want a change in shape on your geometry that is not supported by an edge. It can't be just a bend. So you got to be careful. So if your geometry ever shows that significant torsion, what that's telling you is the detail you're trying to hit is going to need more components than you've got in there. You don't have enough. You're making this one work too hard. I shouldn't be twisting the faces around. Try to keep them nice and flat, relatively flat. A little bit of out of alignment is okay, and you'll start to get used to how much is all right. But you want it to stay relatively flat. And that's what keeps you out of this non-planar geometry issue, which can definitely lead to some problems. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. There's a couple of different ways to go about that. I mean, you could even start modeling it that way to begin with, you know, by drawing out the geometry you want specifically if you're making just a plane like that. But there's a number of different ways to model in an opening. But honestly, I think deleting is probably one of the easier ones. You know, using, like in this instance, the extrude tool. All right, lamina faces. How many of you guys have seen this already? This crazy shading, right? That's Maya's cute little way of telling you that you made a mistake while you're extruding. And what Maya is showing you is that you've got two faces right on top of each other. And they call this Z-fighting or depth issues. You see this moire pattern on your geometry. And the reason is, when you are looking at a piece of geometry in Maya, right, I see shadow information and highlight information, right? Because that's how we perceive depth. We see highlights and shadows, so we see depth. That's how we read it, right? Even though that's a flat image, that's what I determine by looking at that. Now, there's not really light inside of Maya, but we do have a mathematical algorithm or formula that helps us calculate how light behaves. So we can replicate that inside of Maya to determine highlights and shadows. And the way it works is, on the geometry, there are many components that go together to make it. We've talked about vertices, edges, and faces. Those are the components that change the shape of the object. Well, there's also a component on the polygon object that helps you determine light. Now, these are called the normals, and you'll hear a lot about these when you start getting into ZBrush and things like that in terms of the normals and what they do. But the idea of the normals is, much like a thermometer measures temperature, the normals measure light. So what happens is every face of a polygon object has this component called a normal that sticks out of the face. And all it does is read its angle relative to the light. And it gives Maya information about what its angle is so that it can determine, does this face get highlight because it's pointed right at the light? Or is this face away from the light and therefore should be shadow? Does that make sense? And that's all determined by the normals. Now, in order to see the normals on polygon geometry, all you have to do is select the geometry and you go to Display, Polygons, and you choose Face Normals, and you see these little green indicators, and each face has one, and they determine where the face is relative to the light that's shining on it. It also helps to explain to Maya the inside versus the outside of the geometry. The inside will be jet black, the outside gets that gray color, and then that's the direction the normal faces. Does that make sense? Okay, so these normals help us indicate that information. So when we are looking at a piece of geometry, and we've got two faces directly on top of each other, Maya can't figure out which face gets the light and which one gets the shadow because one of them is obscured by the other. Does that make sense? Difficult to determine what's going on. Mathematically, a nightmare in terms of trying to use a tool because Maya's not sure how to cut that. Two faces that occupy exactly the same space. So in issues where this comes up, typically what we end up having to do is delete the face that's on top so that the other face can get light. I'd like you to think of each face on your polygon geometry almost like a leaf on a plant. They all need light. You don't want to have them obscured, so make sure those leaves all get some light because it will lead to some issues. Okay, and again, that's called lamina faces, faces right on top of each other. Now, non-manifold geometry, oh, go ahead.
So for the fourth component normals, so in games, is that how like the normal maps are created for the characters?
Yeah, that's absolutely how normal maps are created because basically what's happening is the normal indicates to the face how much light it gets. So what we do with normal mapping is we pretend and there's a whole bunch of lights coming at from many, many, many different angles. And then basically what we're saying is, here's a very complex object with a lot of curvature on it. There's highlights and shadows all over this thing. Here's a very simple object with not a lot going on. So what I want you to do is take the information of highlight and shadow from the complex object, but put it on the simple one. So what you're doing is you're telling Maya to not really tell the truth about how light and shadow falls on a surface, but use something else as a reference. It's not making it up. It's just using something else. Does that make sense? So what you're doing is you're seeing detail, but it's a lie. Does that make sense? It's almost like looking at a black and white photograph. Photographs are 2D, right? They're flat. But if you look at it, it looks like it's got depth to it because of the highlights and the shadows. Does that make sense? Normal maps work on the same principle. It's a great question. Oh, non-manifold geometry. Non-manifold geometry comes in 3 different varieties. So we got to look out for this. Now, the first variety of non-manifold geometry is 3 faces sharing the same edge. Now, if you take a look, you'll see there's 1, 2, 3 faces, and they're all sharing this edge right here. Mathematically, that can't happen. Objects have insides and outsides, and you just cannot have 3 faces connected to each other by a single edge. If you really needed a detail like this, it would be just a tiny bit thicker, and then you would have an edge that goes from the bottom of that across here to make that okay. You cannot have 3 faces sharing the same one edge. Does that make sense? That's not one variety of non-manifold. Another variety of non-manifold is 2 objects sharing connection to each other using a single vertice. So I've got 2 polygon planes, and they're connected to each other by a single vertice. And the bizarre example I use is, imagine my arm was attached to my body by a single atom. Can't have that. That's too small a component to attach things together. So again, can't have 2 things connected to each other by a single vertice. And the third variety of non-manifold geometry is an issue where you have faces on the same object that are reading opposite normals. Remember, normals tell you the outside of the object. So you can't have the outside of the object, and the very next face is the inside of the object. There needs to be a difference between the inside and the outside, and there's definitely a clear separation. To give you another bizarre example, if you look at your cheek, the skin on the outside of your cheek is of a certain quality, right? The skin on the inside of your cheek, totally different, right? In terms of its look, its appearance, its feel. Could you imagine if you could take your cheek and flip it inside out so that the outside of your cheek was really the inside, and you could see that right next to the rest of the skin on your face? Is that grim or what? Yeah, that's Hellraiser stuff right there. But point being, the inside and the outside, there's definitely a distinct difference between it. And even when you're talking about your cheek, you've got the outside skin, you've got a transition, and then you go to the inside skin. There's definitely an inside and an outside. Does that make sense? So I can't have 2 faces right next to each other that have opposite normals. That can't be. So outside has to face outside, and inside has to face inside. So this can't happen on an object. That's another variety of non-manifold geometry. Faces with 0 surface area. Again, when it comes to extrusion, this happens quite a bit. You see these dots, they are the indication of where a face is on a piece of polygon geometry. It should be right in the middle, because that's indicating the middle of the geometry. Sometimes you will see a dot on an edge, and that doesn't make any sense. And that's because there's literally a face inside there. If you grab the vertice and pull it up, you can see the face hidden inside. And what's happening is you have a face that has been crushed so flat that it is the thickness of an edge, but it is actually a face. So a face with 0 surface area. And again, it causes a lot of issue with tool use, calculation of shading and lighting of the geometry. So there's a lot of issues that crop up from this. And typically what we end up having to do is delete those faces out of there. And if you've got one, there's probably a bunch. So you check that whole edge loop because it probably goes all the way around. And in some instances, just selecting and deleting will make them go away. In other instances, we have to use a the merge tool, which I will show you guys how to do to try to fix the issues. Now, in terms of those dots, because you may not have that set on your computer, I'll show you how to do that, but that's a preference. You can tell Maya, put those little dots on there, would you please? Because actually for first-time modelers, I recommend it. It's really helpful. Not only can you make some selections in the orthographic views and select faces that are on the tops of things, which is kind of cool, but it will give you this indication of problem geometry. You'll see it happening rather than be surprised by it later. Does that make sense? Hell yeah? Okay. So again, hidden faces. I can't have those. They're a problem. Now, you're probably going, okay, great, awesome. So there's some problem geometry I've got to look for. A, it's a lot to remember, and oh my goodness, I have to find it. But the good news is, Maya will help you find it. That's what machines are good for. If you tell it what you're looking for, it will find it for you. The key is you have to recognize it for what it is and then fix it. Does that make sense? Okay, yes. Well, I'm going to show you guys how to do that. That's a preference thing. It's in your Maya preferences, but I'll show you. But that's very handy for first-time modelers. All right, so again, the good news is Maya will help you find this stuff, thank goodness. So the key is using this tool called the cleanup tool. And that's literally what it does. However, and this is the important part, we want Maya to show us the problem geometry, not fix it for us. The tool does have an option, fix it for you. Does that make sense? There is a way, and that is by default turned on, where we're saying, hey Maya, I know you're just an application, and you're not an artist, and you have no idea what it is I'm doing, what my assignment is, or what I need this to do. But you go ahead and change my geometry for me. I trust you, application. That's bad. Does that sound like a good thing, bad thing? That's bad, right? We don't ever let the application do the work for us if we can avoid it. Machines eventually lead to Skynet, so we don't give them any more control than we need to because it's dangerous. So the most important thing is when you're using that tool, you set it to select the problem you're looking for. Don't fix it. Please don't fix it. Just show me where the problem is. I will fix it. I know what I'm doing. Make sense? Okay. So in terms of the cleanup tool, if you go into the mesh menu set, it's down towards the bottom in an area called Optimize. And the tool will pop up. And again, the key is you don't want Maya to fix it for you. You want it to select the problems. So for example, you would say, show me where this person has an itchy rash. Don't try to fix their itchy rash. Just show me where it is. Oh, right there on the knee, no problem. Let's put some Neosporin on it. Excellent, that's all better now. Does that make sense? We don't want Maya going, hey Maya, this person has an itchy rash. You take care of it. I'm sure you'll do fine. You know, Maya will probably cover it in polyurethane or something. So don't let Maya do anything. All right, so let's do some practice identifying and fixing bad geometry, which incidentally is going to be your skill check for today, finding and fixing bad geometry. Not necessarily just cursing, but we will get into this, the way this works. All right, so all right, so here we go. Let me get Maya going. The file that I'm going to demonstrate for you is one of your skill check files. So of course I have to set my project to the skill check file folder in order to have access to it. And I'm going to open up a scene called the cleanup project. Okay, and we have Han Solo's blaster, right? And it looks great. It's beautiful in terms of its appearance, but unfortunately it has a lot of problems, and this is what we're going to have to do, is fix the problems. So what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to go through this model and show you the different problems one at a time and then show you how to fix them. So make sure you can identify the problem and then you know what to do to fix it. because what's going to happen is after I show you all of these different things and how to fix them, then I'm going to give you a piece of geometry that's got problems. And I'm not going to tell you what's wrong with it. You have to find the problem and identify it and then fix it, make it right. Does that make sense? So that's the practical exam after I show you how to find these illnesses. So make sure you're jotting down the various illnesses and what the fixes are for them. Does that make sense? You have to know what thing to do to make it better. Okay, so for the first part of this exercise, what we did was we took all of the problems and we isolated them to separate layers so that you can find them easily. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn all the layers off because it's very difficult to find things when everything is all over the place. It's much easier when you're looking at things one at a time. And we're going to use that same strategy when we're trying to fix stuff. So let's take a look at n-gons as a problem. So here's a piece of geometry. It's the scope from the gun, and it looks lovely, but it has some n-gons on it. And you can probably see them right there. But let's say we didn't know where the things were. Where's the n-gons on this object? Help me find them, Maya, because I need to fix them. So the way you would find these problems and fix them is through using the cleanup tool. These are the steps for using the cleanup tool. Step 1, select the geometry in object mode. It has to be selected and it has to be in object mode. Next, we go to Mesh, Cleanup. All right. Now, when this window opens, it defaults to clean up. That means Maya is going to fix it for you. That is not good. We don't want Maya fixing anything for us. Maya is a menace when it tries to fix things. And just to give you an idea, there's Maya's idea of fixing the problem. Does that look good? No, because Maya is not an artist. Maya does not know what Maya is doing, and that's why we do not let Maya fix anything, right? It's like asking a 5-year-old to paint your living room. All right, so I switch it immediately from cleanup to select. Show me the problem so I can find it. Don't fix it for me, please. Select the problem. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of elements here. I've unchecked all of them because, again, if you tell Maya, look for itchy rash, runny nose, watery eyes, dry throat, balmy skin, like if you ask for 50 different things, it's going to find all those things and you don't know what you're looking at or where the problem is. So what we do is we look for things one at a time so we can find it, isolate it, and fix it. So everything is unchecked. And I'm going to say, find for me faces with more than 4 sides. Because more than 4 is a what kind of face? An n-gon. So I tell it, show me all the faces on this piece of geometry that has more than 4 sides. Help me find them. So you hit apply. And Maya shows you, yep, this is the problem face. And you could be out in the south of France and you tell Maya to find that face that has more than 4 sides. It will select it. And if you press F, it will frame it for you so you know, oh, it must be nearby. Does that make sense? F is frame selected. Make sense? Okay. So now we've got this face and I know it's a problem. Obviously what happened here, or maybe not obviously, is that some edges got deleted by accident. And that happens sometimes while you're working. You don't realize it and you selected some stuff and deleted it. So it's time to fix it. What tool did we say is great for fixing n-gons? Multi-cut tool is terrific for fixing n-gons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Mesh Tools, get my multi-cut tool out, and I'm literally going to fix this. And again, it works on edges, so I will click on an edge and drag, and what I want to do is hang it up on the corner to where it won't go any further. And then I just go to the other side, click and drag until it gets hung up on the corner. All right, right mouse button cuts that one in. Left mouse button again, click and drag, right mouse button. Click and drag, right mouse button. And I'm just connecting stuff. Click and drag, right mouse button. Now I got to come over here. Click and drag, right mouse button. Click and drag, and I can go all the way to this one up here. Click and drag, right mouse button. Click and drag, and it will put in these other two for me right in the middle. Right mouse button. Does that make sense? So now, I'm just going to scoot these guys down a little bit, neaten it up. But now, all the faces have 4 sides again, and I can confirm that by selecting it, tell it to find me the stuff with more than 4 sides, and then that doesn't light up anymore. That's fixed. Make sense? Thank you for playing. So that's how we fix the n-gon issue. We run them down one at a time. Let's look at this unsupported vertices issue. And this is kind of a tricky one. The issue will come up because if I tell Maya, I go to my cleanup tool, and I'm looking for n-gons again, faces with more than 4 sides. And I tell it to find them, and it says, these guys. Well, what do you mean, those guys? They look like rectangles. Those don't look like n-gons. What the heck's wrong with them? Well, what's wrong with them is that there are some unsupported vertices, but I can't see them. Maya just tells me more than 4 sides. So what's the problem? I got to go on a loose vertice hunt. So I have to go to vertex mode because that's what's going to allow me to see the vertices. Now, do you see these vertices in the middle here and down here? They turn this from 1 edge to 2 because of that loose, unsupported vertice. As a result, this face right here has more than 4 sides. It's an n-gon. It's a problem. Now, when it comes to unsupported vertices, you have 2 options. You can either delete them or fix them by connecting them. And here's how you decide. When it comes to unsupported vertices, you can actually delete them if you want to. If you select the vertices in question and you hit delete, they go away because they're not properly connected. They are not supported. In fact, you might be wondering, well, shoot, might I accidentally delete the vertices that were supposed to be there? You can't. If you select every vertice on your model and hit delete, the ones that are unsupported will go away. The ones that are properly connected will not and cannot go away. Make sense? Okay, so here's where the situation gets interesting. Let's say I have a detail of my model that looks like that, right? I'm building the front of Lowe's hardware store. Now, I need that little archway up there. Watch what happens when I delete the unsupported vertices at the top. Grab them, delete them. I lose my little perched roof, right? So I need those vertices. I can't just delete them. So then I have to fix them. Does that make sense? Now I know the solution. I need those guys. Therefore, I've got to come back in here and fix them. Now, in terms of tools that work on quadding things, what tool do we say is fabulous? Multi-cut. So I go to my mesh tools, get the multi-cut out, click, click, click. Come down here. Click. And I hit enter. And you see how it's cutting it in? Connecting these guys to each other. Click, click. Now those are properly connected. Click, click. Now those are connected. Does that make sense? You literally have to recut those edges in there. Make sense? Okay, because that'll leave you with 4-sided faces, and then you don't have that problem anymore. All right, and you're going to have to go all the way around. Flipped normals. The flipped normals issue is pretty straightforward because typically what happens is Maya turns the geometry jet black because that's supposed to be what the inside looks like. So when I select this geometry, like, what the heck happened to this? Well, it's inside out. Now, the way you can confirm that is if you make the normals visible. We talked about those things, right? Those little cactus spikes, they make it look, they show you the outside versus the inside. So if you go to display, polygons, face normals, you'll see, oh, wait a minute, there are the little normals, but they look like they're sticking out. What they're actually doing is they're sticking out through the inside. Does that make sense? This should be the outside of the object, and that's why it's gray in color. And the normals are sticking from the inside through to the outside. And that's what's telling me they're inside out. Display, polygons, face normals. Yep. All right. Now, the good news is it's really easy to fix this. If you have this problem, you just go to Mesh Display, and you choose Reverse. And all that does is flip the geometry back the way it's supposed to be. Everything is gray, and of course, all the little spikes are on the outside. And if you go to the inside, now you'll see there's almost nothing in here. Nice and empty like it should be. Normals are going the right way. So again, to flip, and incidentally, in terms of getting those things off of there, because they're really obnoxious, the only way you can do it is the reverse of turning them on. So you have to go to Display, Polygons, Face Normals, and then that will shut them off. So again, select the geometry in object mode, Mesh Display, Reverse. Now it's facing the right way. Make sense? Hell yeah? Okay, so that's a pretty easy issue. Let's look at non-planar faces. All right. Now, non-planar faces sometimes is hard to see. But in terms of non-planar faces, if you look at this object, there's definitely some torsion on it. And do you see how down here and up at the top of the geometry, you can see the edge that kind of defines the geometry? There's a bright green edge that says this is the end of the geometry and the rest is the background, right? But if you look at the sides, do you see how it's kind of gray? There's no defining edge there. It's just sort of these shaded gray areas. And what that's showing you is that that face has been bent, but there's no edge to support it. So I've got a change in shape, but there's no edge there to support that change in shape. So I've got torsion on the face. Now, this is actually pretty easy to fix. All I'm going to do is grab the vertices on the top row here, and using my rotate tool, I'm just going to take that torsion out so that it is no longer twisted. And what you will notice immediately is when I look at my geometry, when I get to the edge of the geometry, I can see an edge there. There's a bright green edge that says this is where the geometry stops and the background begins. So clearly there's no torsion there anymore. Does that make sense? That's better. That's much more clean. All right. So again, that's non-planar face issue. All right, here's where we're going to get into the merge tool. You guys were asking about this before. Now, if you look at this geometry, you would think, oh, what's wrong with it? It looks beautiful. There's nothing wrong at all. But watch what happens when I go into face mode and I just start selecting faces and moving them. Doesn't it look like I'm using the extrude tool? Look at that. Let me select a face that doesn't have a problem. This is what a face should be doing. Okay? Now watch what this guy does. Do you see how that's not right? What's going on there is I have faces with zero surface area. Remember we talked about the dots should be in the middle of the face? But look, I've got dots on edges here. And what that's showing me is I've got faces that are the thickness of an edge, and they're smashed in there. And that's what's showing me what looks like an extrusion when I try to move those faces. Now, of course, this will wreak havoc with my tools. Of course, this will wreak havoc with lighting and rendering. So this is not a good thing. Now, in terms of getting those out of there, oh, let me show you the preference for putting those little dots on if you want them. If you go to Maya Preferences, and if you go into your categories, choose Selection, you'll see Polygon Selection. Select faces with center or whole face. Whole face is the default. That's no dots. If you turn on Select Faces with Center and hit Save, that's when you get these little dots in the middle. Now, in terms of fixing this, sometimes you can just delete the faces. Like I can select this face right here and hit Delete. And you'll see, oh, there's still a face there. So there were two faces in there squished to the thickness of an edge. So I grab the next one and hit Delete. Ah, now it's gone. Now I go to this one, select it, hit Delete, gone. Grab this one, Delete. Oh, another one in there, Delete, gone. This one, Delete. Another one in there, select it, Delete. Whew, fixed it. But watch what happens when I pull this face out. It's not connected anymore because there were extra faces in there before, and this thing was connected to those faces. So if I delete them, sometimes that face just comes free like that. Obviously not ideal. So let me show you the other way to fix the problem of interior faces with zero surface area. I'm going to use a new tool called the merge tool. Now the merge tool, kind of as its name implies, it makes things stick together. So what I want to do is merge the vertices, because if I glue these vertices together, glue those vertices together, glue those vertices together, and glue those vertices together, it's going to eliminate all the faces that are stuck in that perimeter, because I don't really need them anymore. I've merged them, so Maya will remove them. Now the way the merge tool works is it works on an idea called threshold. And this is the most important aspect of the merge tool, threshold. Threshold means distance. So let's say, for example, Brian is a vertice, I'm a vertice, and you're a vertice. All right? Brian and I are 2 happy grid units apart. You are 4 grid units from Brian and 3 from me. Does that make sense? If I select Brian, myself, and you, and I set my threshold for 2, even though you're selected, you are outside of that range. So when I merge, we will become 1 vertice. Brian and I will become 1 vertice. And even though you're selected, you're not going to merge because you're outside of that threshold. If I set my threshold for 4, we are all within 4 of each other, so we all become 1 vertice. Threshold is critical because if you set your threshold too high, it looks like everything you own just collapses into a black hole. So I know you're excited to see that, and I'll show you. But watch that threshold because it's important. So here's what I'm going to do. To use the merge tool, grab the vertices in question that you'd like to merge. All right, this whole area is affected, so this is what I'm going to merge. Edit mesh, and you'll see merge. And again, the key element here in the options is your threshold distance. I'm going to give myself a big threshold and hit apply. Threshold is very big. Everything collapses into a black hole. Does that make sense? That's when your threshold is too high. Now, I don't want them to all collapse. I just want the 2 vertices that are virtually on top of each other right there. I want those guys to merge. I don't want them to merge with other vertices. So what I'm going to do is set my tolerance for a very, very small number. So I'm going to come in here and put in 0.001. Super small. They have to be on top of each other to merge. Now I hit apply. And oh, wait a minute. It didn't do anything. But look, do you see all those interior faces are gone? It's all fixed. So you could literally do that for your entire model. Just grab all the vertices on any piece that's showing that issue, merge those vertices, problem solved. Problem solved, problem solved. We solved the problem, problem solved. I guess you guys don't watch any Peg plus Cat. All right. Does that make sense? Actually, pretty good show. I don't know if you've seen Peg plus Cat. Very funny. I like the art direction. All right. Make sense? Faces with zero surface area. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at the next issue. Interior faces. All right, this one is sometimes difficult to see in terms of interior faces. But yeah, even if you go into wireframe, it can be difficult to determine what's going on there. But what I'll do is I will leave it shaded, but I'm going to go to X-ray. All right. Now, when I look at this geometry in X-ray mode, you and I both know that when we've got geometry sort of doubled up, the geometry shading gets darker. That's what tells us there's two layers, right? So when I look at this, I can see in the middle of this piece, whatever the heck it is, there's like another floor in there. It's like there's two floors to this thing, whatever the heck it is. I've got some faces on the inside of my geometry that aren't really doing anything. It's not part of the detail. It doesn't open up. It doesn't add to my model in any way. But I've got these faces in here. And if I go inside, you can kind of see, oh, okay. It's like the upper deck, right? And I don't need those faces. Not only are they adding to my poly count, but they're also non-manifold because I've got 1, 2, 3 faces sharing the same edge. Does that make sense? So this interior face has got to go. The good news is it's super easy. You just got to grab them and delete them. So I'm just going to select the faces, and it will be a little bit easier for you to see the faces when I select them than it is when they're sort of hanging out inside. All right. Do you see those faces now? Is that easier to see? Okay. So again, I don't need those faces. They're not doing anything other than adding to my poly count, confusing my tools, and creating non-manifold geometry, all of which are a no-no. So I just delete them. Does that make sense? Hollow it out. Each piece of geometry, unless you're going to open it up, each piece of geometry should be hollow like a chocolate bunny. Shouldn't be anything in there. You have a question?
Yeah, is there a faster way to select those types of faces by selecting the vertex and the vertex in the middle and then having it select all those faces?
Oh, there's a zillion different ways to select things. But in terms of how I demonstrate for you guys, I usually try to be the most obvious I can in terms of the behavior. You will learn faster workflows for things, but if I do everything as fast as I can, you miss stuff. Does that make sense? My goal is not to be as fast as I can. My goal is to make sure everybody understands what the hell I'm talking about. So, but yes, you will always learn faster workflows. Yeah, this is just a little tiny piece of this whole thing. Yep, no, yeah, this is the little tiny piece in here. But yeah, you're always going to be working on how can I go faster. But my objective is teaching. And so I'll use my menus. I'll go to the drop downs and all that stuff. And I have to actually make myself work slower. But it's much better for you guys if I do it that way.
Question, in that instance, would you then go delete that edge?
Yeah, honestly, in terms of that edge, you don't really need it. So could you select that entire edge there and then go to delete edge vertex and just get that out of there? Yeah, you could do that. Because it's not really doing anything. It's adding to your poly count, if nothing else. But one thing you will come to learn later on is there's a such thing as not enough edge loops as well. Because when we get into UV mapping and texturing, those coordinates that the additional edge loop will give you will make your textures align more tightly. So there is a such thing as too dense. There's also a such thing as too light. So you got to find your way to just right when it comes to modeling. But you will find that textures align themselves much better when you've got a little bit more to work with. But at this stage, you want it to be as light and efficient as you can. All right. All right. Let's look at the next All right, so I'm gonna turn that last layer off, and then here's where we get to, dun, 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 your skill check. Now, your skill check is using this exact same file that I was just showing you, and we are going to fix a certain area of that gun. The difference between what we just did and what you're going to do for your Lecture 4 skill check is I showed you where the problems were because we had them on separate layers, so it was easy to identify. Now, I've got a layer for you to work on where there's all kinds of problems, but I don't tell you what they are or where they are. You have to use the tools that I showed you, and obviously your eyes and your brains, to find and fix the issues. All right, so the cleanup tool is your guide, and you're going to fix stuff using it. Now, it's the same file as I was just showing you. So incidentally, if you want to practice before you do this thing, you could do that one layer at a time, just like I did, just like I demonstrated for you. You can see those different things and how you fix it. And then you get to the skill check, and what you'll be doing is you're in Maya, go to the layer called Problem Hunt 1. And that's the one you guys have to do. That's the only one you have to do. And what you'll see is you've got this part of the gun. It's the barrel. I'm going to take it out of X-ray so it's easier to see. So here's the barrel. And there's several pieces, just like the real object is built. And there's several problems. Some of the pieces have more than one problem. So you have to use the cleanup tool to find and fix. So for example, let's start with this barrel. Okay, it looks lovely, but I know there's probably something wrong with it. Let's start with something simple like N-gons. The steps for using the tool are select the geometry and object mode, mesh, cleanup. Select for me faces with more than 4 sides. Apply. Okay, so this face, this face, this face, this face, this face, and this face have more than 4 sides. Those are N-gons. So obviously I'm going to have to fix it. What's the tool we use for N-gons? Multicut. That's the one that works the best. So in terms of fixing it, I'm going to have to get my multicut tool out and start connecting things to each other. Now the good news is, because this is an object that was in theory made by human beings or humanoids or something, it's manufactured, there's going to be a lot of symmetry and repetition. So in terms of what should this look like? Well, I bet you there's another piece right down here I can use as an example of where the edges need to be. Does that make sense? This face right here is identical to that one there. So you can use that as a guide. Recut this face so it looks like that one using the multicut tool. And that will take care of that issue. All right. Now, we've got a bunch of different things in here. Let's find non-planar faces. Let's find lamina faces. Let's find non-manifold geometry. These are all the things we talked about. So one thing at a time, you just ask Maya to look for the problems and you go in and fix them. And each piece has more than one problem. Does that make sense? You just got to figure out what's wrong with it and then fix it. And then obviously you want to save your file and then turn it in. This is your Lecture 4 skill check. Now, we talked about cleaning up geometry being part of the clean geometry category on your self-grade document. So again, I don't expect you to use this on the stuff you're turning in for your week 1 turn-in, but do you think that's going to affect your week 2 turn-in? Definitely. You are going to be using this tool on the geometry you built to find and fix problems. Now, the good news is we are teaching you guys how to model very efficiently, very light, but getting a lot of shape change, and we're showing you good workflows on how to create stuff. You're not going to have as many issues as these models again. Okay, your models will have fewer, thank goodness, because we're showing you a better approach on how to model. However, if you think you will never get your hands on a really badly built model, you're crazy. Because a lot of times what happens is somebody builds a model that's of poor quality and it ends up on your desk and you have to fix it. Because somebody else didn't learn the best way to go about doing this. Does that make sense? I have literally been hired where they're like, hey, can you fix this model? Because a lot of times what happens is a company will hire somebody, you know, they're like, hey, I need to have a Lamborghini built. And a whole bunch of people say, I'll build the Lamborghini for $200. I'll build it for $275. I'll build it for $25. Whoa, winner. Let that guy do it. He's going to do it for $25. And they get a $25 Lamborghini. And then they're like, uh-oh, what do we do with it now? We paid for it. We got it. It's terrible. We got to hire somebody to fix it. So that's how you get that job. Does that make sense? So fixing somebody else's issues, that's a thing. That does happen. That's a great question. Has there ever been a model beyond repair? Yes, there has. I've definitely seen some catastrophic disasters. But if you are ever hired to fix a catastrophic disaster, this is what I would advise you to do. Fix it and remodel it. And then you say, here's the model you gave me and I fixed it. And here's the model that should have been built in the first place. Because then they're going to call you again. Does that make sense? Always do what is exactly asked for first, to the best of your ability. And then you can try to impress them with something else. What you don't want to do, because this is a great question, what you don't want to do is what you think is best, and that's the only thing you did. Like, yeah, I know you hired me to fix this one, but here's this other model, which I think is way better. What do you think, boss? That is a great way to never get called again. Does that make sense? Or fix it not as well as you could have, and you're like, hey, look at this one, it's better. Well, why didn't you spend your valuable time making this one look better? Why are you working on something else that I didn't even ask you to do? That causes issues also. So it's good thinking, but you got to be smart about it. It's a great question, though, because that's the kind of world you're trying to get into. That's the way it works. Always do exactly what you're asked to do to the letter in terms of the detail. And then if you've got time left over, then impress them. Wow, show them what you really know how to do. But better, absolutely. Because then they're going to be like, wow, yeah, that was great. Not only did you do exactly what I asked you to, but look at this much better model you built. I think we're going to use yours. And you know what? Do I have your card? Because guess who's getting another call? The most valuable thing you own is your name and the association your name has with it. Hardworking, determined, problem solver. Does that make sense? You want those words synonymous with your name, because that's how you get called. Because these jobs are crazy. The deadlines are ridiculous. The expectations are through the roof. They need superheroes to do this stuff. And that's who you want to be. You want to be a superhero, the one they call when all hell breaks loose because they know you can make it happen. That's longevity. That's how you stay employed. That's how you become one of the great ones. But that's an awesome question. Thank you for asking. Anything else? We pretty good on this? Yes. The preference? Yes, it's super easy. All you have to do is go to your Maya preferences, open them up, and in the category section, go to selection, and you will see that polygon selection, there's an area called select faces with center or whole face. If you want the dots, you choose center and then hit save, and then you'll have those little dots in there. And like I said, I think for beginners, that's a really good idea. It's very handy. And not to mention the fact that you can be in a side view and select faces on the top of something, because the little faces, those nubs on there, those little dots, they're actually tall as well. They're not just on a flat surface and they're flat like pepperonis. They actually stand up a little bit. So you can actually select a face on the top of the object by grabbing those little faces, which stick up higher than the surface of the geometry. So that's kind of a cool feature of those. Yes?
How do you center the part you want?
Any piece that you select and hit F, that will frame it. So if you're trying to get in on one piece, you know, I could be like way out here, right? Nothing is near me. But if I select the piece and hit F, boom, the outliner.
Like, I use like the piece on my part of that.
No, if you're way the heck out there, go to your outliner, right? We saw how that works. Oh yeah, this is the outliner button right here. Yep. The Maya interface is loaded with shortcuts to things. But I always start you guys going to drop-down menus because I want you to see all the stuff that's in here. Because what happens is if you just hit the quick buttons that are throughout the interface, you miss stuff, right? So if I told you, yeah, you can go to Window Outliner or you can come over here and just click this, you're going to click that. But if you don't go into Windows, you're not going to see, oh wait, general editors, ooh, workspace options. I want you guys to see that stuff. And that's why I don't go too heavy into hotkeys and stuff right away, because I want you to see these other things and go, ooh, what's the node editor? Ooh, settings and preferences. Because these are things that we're going to talk about later on. Does that make sense? I want to build a familiarity with the landscape. It's kind of like GPS. You know, your phone will take you everywhere you want to go, but if you only use your GPS, you don't really remember where everything is because the phone does all the work for you. Does that make sense? If you've got to navigate, you start to recognize landmarks, road names, stores. You can find it again. Does that make sense? The more that's automated, the less you have to think. You know? And that's not necessarily good. But there's definitely a fine line. You don't want to reinvent the wheel either. But if there's some way you can stay sharp, it's always a good idea. Absolutely, they're all on FSO. Yep, I put the slides on FSO so that you can see them. And again, the slides don't contain all the information, but they get you through the bullet points, so you can check them again if you need to. Yep, they should be connected to each lecture activity, I believe, towards the bottom. Because you'll notice for each lecture we have lecture activities and we also have skill checks. So the lecture activities, which you only mark off as having completed them even though they're not for a grade, those are the little steps that you need to take to learn how to be able to do the skill checks. So all that information is there for sure, but that's a great question too. All right, anything else? Okay, that's all I wanted to talk about today. That's all the information we need to know for our lecture 4 skill check. So thank you very much. I apologize for the coughing. I'm like, some days I'm better than others. One of these days I will sleep and breathe and then everything will be good again. But for right now, I sound a little bit like the creature from the Black Lagoon. So I apologize for that, but I'm working on it. But I will see you guys on Thursday. We will do this again. We'll talk about some more fun stuff. And I think we're going to get into like grouping and parenting and all that fun stuff on Thursday. So I'll see you guys then. Thank you very much. Catch you at lab shortly, and we'll have some fun there. Again, if you need some help, show